The warm, humid air of Norfolk, Virginia, carried the scent of the tidewater and the weight of memory. In a modest home, a young Ella Baker sat at the knee of her grandmother, Josephine Elizabeth Ross, listening to stories that shaped a soul. Her grandmother spoke of the old days, of slavery, and of a fierce defiance. She told of being whipped for refusing to marry a man chosen by her enslaver, a story not of victimhood, but of unbroken will. These tales were not mere family history. They were a living inheritance of dignity and resistance, planting seeds in Ella that would grow into a lifelong commitment to justice. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows on the walls, but in that room, a quiet strength was being forged, one story at a time. From Norfolk, the family moved to North Carolina, where the landscape shifted to rolling fields and pine forests. Ella's childhood was steeped in the rhythms of a close-knit Black community, where church gatherings and mutual aid were the bedrock of survival. Her mother, a schoolteacher, and her father, a waiter on the steamships, instilled the value of education and hard work. But it was the oral tradition, the whispered accounts of rebellion and the sung hymns of hope, that gave Ella her first lessons in collective power. She learned that ordinary people, bound together by shared struggle, could resist oppression not just with grand gestures, but with everyday acts of courage and solidarity. The warm Carolina sun on her face as she walked to school was a quiet reminder of the world she was determined to change. In 1918, Ella Baker entered Shaw University in Raleigh, a historically Black institution founded just after the Civil War. The campus, with its red brick buildings and ancient oaks, was a place of both promise and strict social codes. Here, Baker's intellect sharpened, but so did her critical eye. She challenged the university's policy that forbade students from walking on the grass, seeing it as an arbitrary rule that stifled personal freedom. Her defiance was not loud but principled, a reflection of the quiet rebellion she had absorbed from her grandmother. She excelled academically, delving into sociology and philosophy, and honing the analytical skills that would later dissect systems of power. The soft rustle of pages in the library and the earnest debates in assembly halls became her training ground for a life of organizing. As a student, Baker also confronted the colorism and class divisions within the campus community, recognizing early that oppression could be multifaceted. She was not content with mere personal achievement. She believed that education should serve the liberation of all. She joined the debate team, not for trophies, but to sharpen arguments against injustice. In the evenings, she would walk along the tree-lined paths, the scent of magnolias in the air, pondering how to turn ideals into action. Her peers knew her as serious and fiercely intelligent, a young woman who listened more than she spoke, but whose words carried weight. The chapel bells tolling the hours marked the steady passage of time, but Baker was already thinking beyond the university gates, toward a broader struggle. Baker graduated as valedictorian in 1927, a remarkable achievement in an era of limited opportunities for Black women. The commencement ceremony, held under the warm spring sun, was a moment of pride, yet for Baker, it was not an endpoint. She had absorbed the lessons of her grandmother's resilience, the communal strength of her upbringing, and the intellectual rigor of her education. She understood that true leadership was not about individual accolades, but about empowering others to find their own voice. The diploma she held was a tool, not a trophy. As she left the campus, the iron gates closing behind her, she carried with her a vision of a world where dignity was not a privilege but a birthright, and where ordinary people could achieve extraordinary change together. In the quiet of those early years, the foundation of a revolutionary life was laid. The stories of slavery and rebellion, the challenges to unjust rules, and the commitment to collective uplift were not isolated incidents, but threads woven into a coherent philosophy. Baker learned that resistance was rooted in identity and community, not in charismatic leaders. She saw that the most enduring power came from the ground up, from people sharing their stories and building solutions together. The soft glow of dawn over the North Carolina fields seemed to mirror the quiet, persistent light she would bring to the darkest corners of injustice. Her journey was just beginning, but the roots of her resistance ran deep and strong. The hum of the New York City subway in the 1930s was a far cry from the quiet fields of North Carolina. Ella Baker arrived in Harlem, a neighborhood pulsing with the energy of the Great Migration and the creativity of the Harlem Renaissance. Brownstone buildings lined the streets, their stoops filled with neighbors exchanging news and dreams. Baker found a small apartment, its window overlooking a fire escape where she could watch the rhythm of the city, children playing double dutch, vendors selling vegetables from carts, the distant sound of jazz from a basement club. The air was thick with both the smoke of industry and the promise of new possibilities. Here, amidst the economic devastation of the Great Depression, Baker began to weave her philosophy of collective empowerment into the fabric of everyday life. She soon joined the Young Negroes Cooperative League, an organization dedicated to building economic self-sufficiency through cooperative businesses. The League's office was a modest storefront on a busy avenue, its windows plastered with posters about boycotts and buying black. Inside, Baker worked alongside young radicals, planning grocery cooperatives and credit unions that could shield the community from exploitation. She believed that economic power was foundational to freedom, and she spent her days organizing meetings in church basements and community centers. The clatter of a mimeograph machine producing flyers, the smell of ink and paper, became the backdrop of her work. In the dim light of these gathering spaces, she saw faces hardened by poverty but softened by hope, and she learned to listen to their needs rather than dictate solutions. Baker's voice also found an outlet in journalism. She wrote for the Negro National News and other publications, her articles dissecting the economic and social conditions of Black Americans. Sitting at a small wooden desk by a window, the gray light of a New York winter filtering in, she crafted arguments for cooperative economics and grassroots organizing. Her prose was clear and forceful, aimed not at intellectuals, but at the working people she sought to serve. She believed that information was a tool of liberation, and she used her pen to expose injustice and share strategies for resistance. The distant rumble of the elevated train was a constant reminder of the city's relentless pace, but Baker remained focused, her typewriter keys clicking steadily as she built a body of work that connected local struggles to a broader movement. In 1940, Baker began working with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People as a field secretary, a role that would take her far from Harlem streets. She traveled across the South, a region still rigidly segregated, where the threat of violence was a daily reality. By bus and by car, she journeyed through dusty towns and rural hamlets, meeting with local leaders in their homes and churches. The southern landscape unfolded before her, cotton fields stretching to the horizon, sharecropper shacks, and the stark beauty of moss-draped oaks. In these humble settings, Baker's skill as an organizer shone. She did not arrive with a grand plan. Instead, she sat in living rooms, drank sweet tea, and asked questions. She believed that the people themselves were the experts on their own oppression, and her role was to help them build the structures to fight it. Her work involved establishing and strengthening NAACP branches, training local leadership, and conducting membership drives. It was exhausting, often thankless work. She faced the constant hum of segregation, the separate waiting rooms, the hostile glances, the ever-present danger of night rides through unfamiliar territory. But Baker was undeterred. In the dimly lit sanctuaries of small churches, she would speak not from a pulpit but from the floor, her voice calm and steady, urging collective action. The flicker of kerosene lamps illuminated faces full of both fear and determination. She taught them how to organize voter registration campaigns and challenge discriminatory laws, always emphasizing that leadership must come from within the community, not from distant headquarters. The heat of a southern summer night, the chirping of crickets outside, became the setting for quiet revolutions. Through her travels, Baker developed a profound respect for the resilience of ordinary people. She saw how women, in particular, held communities together, yet were often sidelined in formal leadership. This observation deepened her critique of top-down, male-dominated organizations. The work was slow and incremental, but Baker measured success not in headlines, but in the growing confidence of local activists. She returned to Harlem periodically, the familiar skyline a welcome sight, but she was forever changed by the faces and stories she had encountered. The city's noise now seemed to carry the echoes of 1,000 small-town meetings, a chorus of voices she had helped to amplify. Her years in Harlem and on the road had forged her into a master organizer, ready for the larger stages of the civil rights movement. A gentle rain falls on a quiet street in Atlanta, the water tracing silver lines down window panes. Inside a modest office, a woman sits at a wooden desk piled high with papers. The air smells of damp wool and fresh ink. Her name is Ella Baker, and she is building an organization from the ground up. The year is 1957, and the echoes of the Montgomery bus boycott still hum in the air like a fading hymn. The boycott had lasted over a year, a testament to the endurance of ordinary people who walked miles each day rather than submit to segregation. Now, out of that victory, a new coalition is taking shape, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. Its purpose is to coordinate nonviolent protests across the South, to turn local sparks into a regional flame. But first, someone has to set up the office, write the letters, and build the networks. That someone is Ella Baker. She works late into the night, the glow of a desk lamp casting warm circles on the walls. As the SCLC's first executive director, she is the organization's backbone, though she is rarely in the spotlight. While the ministers who lead the group preach from pulpits and pose for photographs, Baker handles the unglamorous labor of organizing. She creates filing systems, drafts press releases, and travels to small towns to register voters. She understands that movements are not built on speeches alone. They need phone trees, mailing lists, and trusted local contacts. In a time before email or social media, this work is painstaking and slow. Baker types letters on a heavy manual typewriter, each keystroke a small act of defiance. She knows that every name added to a list, every church basement secured for a meeting, strengthens the foundation of the movement. Baker's approach is rooted in her deep respect for grassroots leadership. She believes that the people who live in a community are its best experts. When she travels through the rural South, she doesn't arrive with instructions. She arrives with questions. What do you need? What are your strengths? How can we support you? This philosophy often puts her at odds with the SCLC's male clergy leadership, who favor a top-down structure centered on charismatic figures. In their view, the pastor leads the flock. But Baker sees a different model, a circle of equals, where leadership emerges from the group and decisions are made collectively. She calls it group-centered leadership, and it will become her lifelong creed. Tensions simmer beneath the surface of SCLC meetings. Baker is the only woman in the inner circle, and her voice is often dismissed or ignored. She is not a preacher, not a man, and not content to simply take minutes and make coffee. She challenges what she sees as a cult of personality around Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not out of disrespect, but out of a conviction that the movement must outlast any single individual. She worries that relying too heavily on one leader makes the whole effort fragile. If that leader is silenced, what happens to the people? Her questions are met with polite nods and little change. The ministers are accustomed to being in charge, and Baker's quiet persistence becomes a source of friction. Despite the challenges, Baker's work is indispensable. She crisscrosses the South in her car, a lone figure on dusty highways, passing cotton fields and sharecroppers' shacks. She meets with local activists in living rooms and church halls, listening to their stories and strategizing their next steps. She helps establish the Citizenship Education Program, teaching African Americans to read and write so they can pass voter registration tests. This program is a lifeline for thousands, turning fear into empowerment. Baker knows that literacy is a key to freedom, and she pours her energy into training teachers and developing materials. The work is exhausting, but she is driven by a sense of duty inherited from her grandmother, who once told her stories of slavery and resistance. By 1960, Baker's relationship with the SCLC leadership has grown strained. She feels that the organization is too focused on mass rallies and not enough on sustained, local organizing. She sees young people brimming with energy and ideas, but the SCLC seems hesitant to fully embrace them. Baker believes that the next wave of the movement will come from these young people, and she is ready to nurture it. Her time at the SCLC has taught her the power of institutional support, but also its limits. She has learned that true change comes not from the top down, but from the ground up. As the decade turns, a new chapter is about to begin, and Ella Baker will be at its heart, guiding a generation of student activists toward their own vision of freedom. The lunch counter is a long, gleaming stretch of chrome and formica, reflecting the fluorescent lights of the Woolworths store. On February 1st, 1960, four young black men sit down on the red vinyl stools and ask for coffee. They are refused, but they do not leave. They sit in quiet dignity as the world around them shifts. This simple act in Greensboro, North Carolina, ignites a fire that spreads across the South. Within weeks, sit-ins erupt in dozens of cities as students take the lead in challenging segregation. The energy is electric, spontaneous, and deeply threatening to the old order. And in a small apartment in Atlanta, Ella Baker reads the news with a knowing smile. She has been waiting for this moment. She knows that these young people need support, guidance, and the freedom to shape their own movement. Baker immediately begins working the phones. She contacts student leaders across the South, urging them to come together for a conference. She envisions a gathering where they can share experiences, strategize, and build a network independent of the established civil rights organizations. She convinces the SCLC to fund the event, but she insists that the students themselves must own it. On Easter weekend, April 1960, over 200 students converge on Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, Baker's own alma mater. The campus is alive with the rustle of spring leaves and the murmur of excited voices. In the red brick buildings and under the shade of oak trees, a new generation of activists is finding its voice. At the conference, Baker delivers a speech that crystallizes her philosophy. She tells the students that their movement must be more than a momentary protest against lunch counter segregation. It must aim for the complete transformation of society. She urges them to form their own organization, one based on group-centered leadership rather than a single charismatic figure. This is a radical notion in a time when the civil rights movement is often defined by prominent ministers. Baker believes that true power lies in the collective, in the ability of ordinary people to make decisions together. The students listen intently. They have grown weary of being told to wait, to be patient, to let their elders handle things. Baker's words give them permission to lead. Out of that conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, pronounced SNCC, is born. Baker becomes the group's mentor and guiding spirit, though she never seeks a formal leadership position. She is the adult advisor who respects their autonomy. She helps them set up an office in Atlanta, a cramped space filled with the clatter of a mimeograph machine and the smell of fresh ink. Here, SNCC members plan voter registration drives in the most dangerous parts of the South. They live on subsistence wages, often sleeping on floors, driven by a fierce commitment to justice. Baker is a constant presence, offering advice, asking probing questions, and reminding them to trust the wisdom of local communities. Baker's influence on SNCC is profound. She instills in the young activists her belief that leadership should be fluid and shared. In SNCC meetings, everyone sits in a circle. Decisions are made by consensus, not by decree. This can be messy and time-consuming, but Baker sees it as essential to building a democratic movement. She warns against the seduction of fame and media attention, urging the students to keep their focus on the people they serve. Her lessons are not always easy. Some students find her expectations demanding. She pushes them to think deeply and act strategically. But they come to revere her as the godmother of SNCC, a title that reflects both their affection and their respect. One of Baker's most significant contributions is her insistence that SNCC remain independent from the SCLC and other established groups. She knows that the older organizations might try to absorb or control the student energy. She fights to secure SNCC's own funding and infrastructure, even as it creates tensions with her former colleagues. This independence allows SNCC to develop its own radical identity, embracing nonviolence as a way of life and committing to long-term community organizing. The students learn to listen before they speak, to work alongside sharecroppers and domestic workers, and to challenge not just segregation, but the entire system of white supremacy. As the 1960s unfold, SNCC becomes one of the most dynamic and influential forces in the civil rights movement. Its members will lead freedom rides, register thousands of voters, and endure brutal violence with unwavering courage. And at the heart of it all is Ella Baker's quiet, steadfast vision. She never seeks the spotlight, but her fingerprints are on every major campaign. She has shown that a movement does not need a single hero. It needs 1,000 ordinary heroes working together. In the shade of the Shaw University oaks, a seed was planted, and it would grow into a mighty tree of liberation. In the sweltering Mississippi heat of June 1964, a quiet hum of determination filled the air. Dusty roads stretched between fields of cotton and sharecroppers' cabins, where the promise of change stirred like a breeze. Ella Baker, now in her early 60s, watched over this landscape not from a podium, but from the back rooms of community centers and church basements. She was a mentor to the young organizers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, who were about to launch one of the most daring campaigns of the civil rights movement, Freedom Summer. Their goal was to shatter the wall of Black disenfranchisement in Mississippi, where only a tiny fraction of eligible African Americans were registered to vote due to intimidation, literacy tests, and outright violence. Baker's role was not to lead from the front, but to nurture the courage and strategy of those who did. She believed deeply that the people who suffered injustice were the ones best equipped to dismantle it, and so she poured her wisdom into the students who would carry this work forward. In small towns like Rollville and Hattiesburg, SNCC workers set up freedom schools in church halls and under the shade of sprawling oaks. These were not ordinary classrooms. Here, adults and children alike learned to read and write, but also to question the system that kept them poor and powerless. They studied Black history, discussed their rights, and practiced filling out voter registration forms. Baker, though often behind the scenes, had helped shape this educational philosophy, one rooted in critical thinking and collective empowerment. The freedom schools became oases of hope, where the light of knowledge pushed back against the shadows of Jim Crow. Young volunteers, many of them Black Mississippians, taught with patience and passion, knowing that literacy was a weapon against oppression. The air buzzed with the sound of reciting poetry, debating citizenship, and dreaming of a different future. Meanwhile, the massive voter registration drive unfolded across the state. SNCC field secretaries, often accompanied by local leaders, went door to door through rural communities, risking their lives to persuade neighbors to register. Baker's influence was evident in their approach. They listened first, building trust and letting the community set the pace. The work was slow and dangerous. Night riders and sheriff's deputies lurked in the darkness, but the organizers pressed on, their footsteps echoing on creaking porches as they spoke of dignity and the ballot. Baker had long argued that the vote was not an end in itself, but a tool for communities to demand better schools, fair wages, and an end to police brutality. She saw Freedom Summer as a crucial step in a much longer journey towards self-determination. To amplify their cause, SNCC made a controversial decision. They invited hundreds of white college students from the North to join the campaign. The reasoning was strategic. White volunteers, it was hoped, would attract national media attention and perhaps shield local Black communities from the worst violence. Baker supported the inclusion but was wary of its pitfalls. She knew that bringing in privileged outsiders could easily overshadow the leadership of Black Mississippians, recreating the very hierarchies they sought to dismantle. Tensions simmered as some white volunteers, however well-intentioned, struggled to accept direction from Black peers. Baker's teachings reminded the SNCC staff to stay rooted in their principle of group-centered leadership, ensuring that decisions remained in the hands of those with the most at stake. It was a delicate balance and not always successfully maintained. The summer's efforts culminated in a bold challenge at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, formed by SNCC and local activists, demanded to be seated in place of the all-white regular delegation. Baker watched from the sidelines as sharecroppers and maids testified before the nation, their voices trembling but resolute. The party's bid was ultimately rejected in a compromise that offered only 2 symbolic seats. For many, it was a bitter defeat. Baker, however, saw it as a transformative moment. The struggle had exposed the moral rot of the Democratic establishment and galvanized a generation of organizers. She reminded the young activists that setbacks were not the end, they were lessons. The real victory was in the thousands of people who had discovered their own power, a flame that no convention could extinguish. As the Mississippi summer faded into autumn, the landscape bore witness to both tragedy and triumph. The burned crosses and bombed churches stood alongside new voter rolls and awakened communities. Baker's quiet presence had been a steady anchor through it all. She never sought credit, preferring to nurture the collective strength that would outlast any single campaign. In the years to come, the seeds planted during Freedom Summer would sprout in movements far beyond Mississippi, a testament to her unwavering belief that ordinary people, when organized, could change the world. Imagine a modest apartment in Harlem, the late 1970s. Soft afternoon light filters through lace curtains, falling upon a woman with silver hair and steady eyes. She sits at a worn wooden desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, pamphlets, and letters from across the globe. This is Ella Baker, now in her 70s, still writing, still organizing, still believing that ordinary people hold the power to change the world. The room is quiet except for the scratch of her pen and the distant hum of city life below. Here, in this humble space, the seeds of global liberation are being nurtured, one letter at a time. Baker's journey did not end with the height of the civil rights movement. Instead, her later years became a testament to her unwavering commitment to human dignity, extending far beyond the borders of the United States. She turned her attention to struggles that others often overlooked, connecting the fight for Black freedom to a broader, international vision of justice. In the 1970s, Baker became a vocal supporter of the Puerto Rican independence movement. She saw the island's colonial status as a direct parallel to the oppression faced by African Americans, recognizing that the denial of self-determination was a global affliction. She worked closely with the Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee, attending rallies, writing articles, and lending her strategic mind to their cause. For Baker, it was not about charity, but about solidarity, a shared struggle against imperialism and racism. She often spoke at community centers and church basements, her voice calm but resolute, explaining how the exploitation of Puerto Rico benefited the same systems that maintained segregation and poverty in the South. Her advocacy was rooted in the belief that no one is free until everyone is free, and she tirelessly connected these dots for a new generation of activists who were beginning to see their work in a global context. As the anti-apartheid movement gained momentum in the 1980s, Baker was among the first to recognize its significance. She joined the Free South Africa movement, participating in demonstrations outside the South African Embassy in Washington, D.C., and urging her networks to divest from companies doing business with the apartheid regime. At an age when many would have retired, she stood shoulder to shoulder with students and workers, her presence a bridge between the civil rights era and the emerging global justice movements. She hosted gatherings in her apartment, where young organizers from various causes would sit on the floor, drinking tea and absorbing her wisdom. She would tell them about the importance of listening to local leadership, of building from the ground up, and of never letting a single charismatic figure overshadow the collective. These intimate sessions were her classroom, and her lessons were drawn from decades of trial and triumph. Throughout these years, Baker's living space became a living archive of her philosophy. The walls were adorned with photographs of SNCC workers, African liberation leaders, and Puerto Rican activists, a visual map of her interconnected struggles. Her desk was cluttered with typewritten drafts of speeches and newsletters, each one a careful argument for decentralized, participatory democracy. She remained a fierce critic of top-down leadership, even as she mentored those who would go on to lead prominent organizations. Her critique was never personal, it was structural. She believed that the movement's sustainability depended on the empowerment of many, not the elevation of a few. In quiet conversations and public forums alike, she would repeat her mantra, "Strong people don't need strong leaders." This idea, radical in its simplicity, became the cornerstone of her enduring legacy. Baker's influence on grassroots organizing is perhaps her most profound contribution. She did not leave behind a traditional organization bearing her name, but her fingerprints are on every movement that emphasizes community-led change. The concept of leaderless movements, often misunderstood, was her antidote to the cult of personality. She saw how reliance on a single leader could cripple a movement if that leader was co-opted, killed, or simply burned out. Instead, she advocated for group-centered leadership, where skills and responsibilities are distributed widely and decisions are made collectively. This model was put into practice by SNCC and later inspired groups like the Black Lives Matter Network, which operates through decentralized chapters. Baker's vision was not about the absence of leadership, but about the abundance of leaders, each one stepping forward when needed and stepping back to make room for others. It was a quiet, persistent revolution in how change is made. Her later years also illuminated a crucial limitation of the movements she helped build, the challenge of sustaining momentum after a major victory or defeat. Baker keenly observed how the energy of Freedom's summer and the subsequent disillusionment with the Democratic Party left many local communities exhausted and under-resourced. She noted that without strong local institutions and ongoing education, the departure of national attention could leave a vacuum. This was not a failure of her philosophy, but a reality of any struggle that relies on outside volunteers and media spotlight. She spent her final years addressing this gap, emphasizing the need for long-term investment in community organizing, voter education, and economic cooperatives, the slow, unglamorous work that outlasts headlines. Her later writings reflect a sober assessment. Liberation is not a single event, but a continuous process of building power from the ground up. In the dim glow of evening, Ella Baker would often sit by her window, looking out at the Harlem streets she had walked for decades. The neighborhood had changed, but the rhythms of daily life continued, children playing, neighbors chatting on stoops, the distant sound of jazz from a radio. She understood that true change happened in these spaces, in the connections between people, not in the halls of power alone. Her legacy is not captured in a single speech or moment, but in the countless organizers who carry her principles forward. She taught that lasting change comes from empowered communities, not charismatic individuals, and that every person has the capacity to be a catalyst for justice. As the city lights flickered on, she would reach for another letter, another pamphlet, another chance to plant a seed. And in that quiet, steadfast work, the heartbeat of the movement continued.